I told my Amish husband I could not carry another baby, and by supper the whole house had already turned cold, though nothing about the kitchen had changed. The same kettle on the same black stove, the same 6 chairs around the same table, the same bread cooling under the same dish towel, and yet I remember standing at the counter afterward, feeling the temperature of the room drop the way water drops before it freezes, quietly, without asking permission, and I remember thinking that I had said such a small sentence, 6 words, spoken low, not shouted, not wept, just laid on the table between us like a plate that did not match the set. And I had not expected the room itself to flinch.
I was 29 years old that winter, old enough to have buried 1 child and raised 3 living ones, old enough to know the weight of my own hands by the ache in them come evening, and I had believed, foolishly maybe, that 29 years of obedience had purchased me at least the right to say I was tired without it being counted against me. It had not. That morning became the hinge of my whole life, though I did not know it yet, and it is the reason I am sitting here now, in a kitchen that is mine and no one else's, telling you what happened after I said the sentence, and what it cost, and what I found on the other side of the cold. My name does not matter yet. Where I am from does not matter yet either, not because I am ashamed of it, but because some things are better understood once you have walked the road with me a little. So for now, only know that I grew up plain, in a farming community where the roads had no streetlights, and the fields told you the season better than any calendar could. And I married young, as we all did, and I believed, as we all were taught to believe, that a woman's body was a kind of tool the community had lent her, useful for bearing and feeding and mending, and that to say the tool was worn down was very close to blasphemy. I want to tell this the way it happened, slowly, the way frost creeps up a window pane, rather than the way a storm breaks, because that is how it truly went. I was raised the 3rd of 9 children on a dairy farm, where my father's word was law and my mother's silence was liturgy, and by the time I was old enough to understand anything about my own life, I already understood the order of things without anyone needing to explain it to me. God first, then the church, then the bishop, then the husband, then the wife, then the children, and beneath the children, if there was room left over, a woman's own wants, folded small and put away like a good dress saved for a funeral. We did not call this cruelty, we called it faithfulness. There is a phrase we used, Gelassenheit, which means something like yielding or surrender, and it was spoken of as the highest form of beauty a woman could achieve, more beautiful than a full pantry, more beautiful than a clean floor, more beautiful even than a healthy baby, because Gelassenheit meant you had made yourself soft enough to disappear into the will of everyone above you without complaint. And there was another word, used more sparingly, used almost like a blade kept sheathed until needed, Hochmut, which means pride, and I learned early that Hochmut did not only mean vanity, the way outsiders think of pride. For a woman, Hochmut could mean something as small as saying out loud that her body hurt, or that her heart was tired, or that she did not think she could bear one more thing. To name your own limit was to risk being called proud, and pride, in our world, was nearly the only sin that could not be forgiven quietly. I met the man who became my husband at a barn raising, the autumn I turned 19. He was not the sort of man who drew attention in a room. He was quiet, in the way deep water is quiet, and he had large, careful hands, the kind that could set a foal's leg or mend a hinge without a wasted motion, and when he spoke to me the first time it was only to ask if I would pass a hammer, and yet something in the plainness of it settled into me. Our courtship was the courtship everyone had, buggy rides after singings, long silences that felt fuller than words, a slow accumulation of trust rather than romance as the English understand it. When he asked me to marry him, he did not kneel or make a speech. He said, "If you are willing, I would be glad to build a life with you," and I said yes, because it felt like the truest sentence anyone had ever said to me, and because saying yes was, in our world, simply what a good daughter did when a good man asked. We married in November, the benches hard, the sermons long, the tables afterward groaning under more food than any family could eat in a week. And I remember standing in my new dress, stiff and dark, feeling admired and exhausted in equal measure, and thinking that this feeling, this suitable, settled feeling, must be what happiness was supposed to feel like from the inside. Our first child came the following autumn, a son with a serious little face that made the older women laugh and say he looked like he was already worried about the harvest. Then a daughter 2 years later. Then a second son who lived only 3 days, whom we buried on a gray afternoon with almost no one outside the family, knowing there had been a child to lose at all, because grief too was something we were taught to carry privately, folded small like everything else. Then, after a labor so long, the midwife herself grew pale, another daughter. By the time I was 28, I had been pregnant 6 times, had 4 children breathing under my roof, and 1 small grave under a maple tree behind the meeting house, and I had begun to notice something in myself that frightened me more than any of the labors had, a kind of hollowness that did not lift no matter how much I slept. A heaviness behind my eyes that had nothing to do with the hour, a sense that my own body had become less like a home and more like a field that had been planted too many seasons running without ever being allowed to lie fallow. I want to be honest that I did not resent my children. I loved them the way you love your own hands, without needing to examine it. What I feared was not motherhood. What I feared was the ledger, the sense that my body had become a shared account that everyone could draw from, and I alone could never withdraw from, and that this was expected to continue indefinitely, without pause, without permission, until it simply could not continue anymore, and something broke that could not be mended with rest. So on that frost-white morning, with the kettle complaining on the stove and my husband buttoning his shirt with his back to me, I said it. I did not plan the moment. I had simply reached the end of a long private road and found myself standing at its edge with the words already in my mouth. I said, "I do not think my body can carry another baby, and I want you to hear me." He did not turn around right away. His hand paused at his collar button, and for 3 or 4 seconds that felt much longer, the whole kitchen seemed to hold its breath along with him. Then he finished buttoning his shirt, picked up his hat, and said only, "We will talk of it later," and walked out to the barn, and that was the beginning of the cold. I do not think he meant, in that first moment, to punish me. I think he simply did not know what shape to put around a sentence he had never been given permission to hear. But the days that followed taught me that not knowing what to do with a woman's limit, and choosing to freeze her out for having one, can look, from the inside, almost identical. The cold did not arrive all at once. It came in what I came to think of afterward as stages, though at the time I only felt the temperature falling and did not yet have the language to count the steps. The first stage was simply my husband's silence, which was its own kind of weather. He did not raise his voice. He did not argue. He answered our children when they spoke to him and thanked me for meals without lifting his eyes from his plate. And at night he lay at the far edge of our bed, not touching me, not speaking, so that the 6 inches between us felt wider than the north field in January. A house can grow cold, I learned, without the fire ever going out, simply by one person deciding that warmth is a reward to be withheld until the other person surrenders. The second stage arrived wearing my mother's face. She came on a Tuesday with a shoe-fly pie and a basket of mending, and she talked of the weather and the hens and whether the south fence had been fixed, and only near the end, while threading a needle and not looking at me, did she say the sentence I have never fully put down since. She said, "A wife who lets the cold into her own house has no right to complain when the whole family shivers." I told her, plainly, that I was simply tired, and she nodded without lifting her eyes and said, "Most women are," and I understood, even then, that she had not come to comfort me. She had come, out of what she believed was love, to fold me back into the shape the family required. The third stage came from my husband's sister, who visited with coffee cake and the particular bright carefulness of a woman sent to test the air. She spoke of a cousin's wedding, of a neighbor's calves, and then, almost gently, of a woman 2 districts over, who had grown difficult after her 5th child, saying the word difficult the way one says a diagnosis. She added cream to coffee she had always taken black, and said, "We must be careful not to mistake our burdens for something worth resenting," and I understood the sideways shape of the warning, even though no one in that kitchen had raised their voice even once. The 4th stage was the bishop's wife, a tall, dry-handed woman who arrived unannounced and admired my pantry and asked, in a voice like folded cloth, whether I had been praying over my unrest, and when I said I did not know what answer God had given me, she said, "Sometimes not knowing is only another word for resisting," and placed one light hand on my shoulder and told me that peace would return when order returned. And I stood in the doorway after her buggy pulled away with my youngest heavy on my hip and thought, if peace requires my disappearance, I no longer want to call it peace. The final stage, the one that told me the whole community had been consulted, even though no formal meeting had ever been announced, was the bishop himself, who came on a Thursday evening in a clean shirt he had clearly put on for the visit, while my husband wore his own clean shirt and could not meet my eyes. The bishop accepted coffee, admired the woodpile, asked after the children, and then folded his hands and spoke of seasons of discouragement and the danger of letting fear speak louder than faith, and said that a woman's calling was often costly, and that Hachmut could be subtle, could look, from the outside, exactly like exhaustion. I understood, sitting at my own table with the good cups out, that my tiredness had already been renamed. It was no longer tiredness. It had become, in the language of everyone who mattered, rebellion. After the bishop left that night, my husband said only one sentence to me, and it found every soft place I had left. He said, "Why must you make a simple thing so hard?" As though bearing 7 children by 29 were simple, as though disappearing quietly were the natural, easy shape of a life, and wanting otherwise were the strange, difficult thing. I did not sleep well for a long time after that. I would lie awake beside his breathing, staring at the small square of moonlight on the wall, and imagine I could see the whole frame of my life, the way you see the rafters when the plaster has fallen away, church and family and marriage and motherhood and silence, all joined so tightly that to question one beam felt like threatening to bring the entire roof down on everyone I loved. It was an older widow in our district, a woman named Ruth, who first said the true thing out loud to me, at a quilting frolic in late February, the room thick with steam and starch, and the low murmur of women's voices around the frame. Ruth was nearly 70, sharp-tongued in the way people call inconvenient women sharp, and while we stood alone for a moment near the stove, snapping beans into a bowl, she said, without even looking up, "You think this is about babies. It is not." She let that sit a moment, then added, "It is about whether a woman's body can ever belong to her again once everyone around her has agreed to call her obedience holy." Then she wiped her hands on her apron and went back to the frame, and left me standing there with an empty coffee pot, and a feeling that something in me had gone very still, not calmer, but clearer, as though a fog I had been walking through my whole life had thinned just enough to show me the shape of the road beneath my feet. After Ruth's sentence, I began to notice the choreography of everything that had happened to me: my husband's silence, my mother's proverb, my sister-in-law's sideways correction, the bishop's wife's spiritual language, the bishop's costly, patient warning, each one gentle enough on its own that objecting to any single one of them would have made me look unreasonable, and all of them together forming a ladder built for exactly one purpose: to make the cost of naming my own limit feel higher than the cost of losing myself entirely. No one had shouted at me even once. No one had needed to. That, I came to understand, is how the gentlest systems do their harshest work. It was an ordinary afternoon in April that finally moved me, though nothing dramatic happened in it. I was hanging my husband's shirts on the line behind the house. the ground soft with thaw, my own dress damp against my legs from the wash water, when an English woman stopped her car on the road to ask directions from a neighbor. I remember her laughing at something he said, an easy, unhurried sound, and then opening the back door of her car so her small daughter could climb out, one boot yellow and one boot red, mismatched on purpose it seemed, and the mother crouched down and let the child choose her own coat before they walked inside. That was the whole of it, a stranger letting a little girl choose. But it went into me like a splinter of light, and I stood there with a wet shirt in my hands and thought, my own daughters will grow up and be told that disappearing is the same as holiness, unless something changes before they are old enough to believe it. I did not feel brave in that moment. I felt tired in an entirely new direction, the way you feel when a long fever finally breaks and leaves you weak but clear-headed. I will not tell you every detail of the leaving, because some of it belongs to a different telling, but I will say there was a tin box of egg money hidden behind a loose board in the barn, and a Mennonite woman in town who had once looked at me a moment too long and left her telephone number folded inside a pattern envelope, as though she had been waiting for the day I would understand what she was quietly offering. And there was a gray morning in early June when my whole body shook so hard I had to sit on the bench by the door before I trusted my legs to carry me down the lane. And then, at last, there was leaving. I will tell you plainly that what came after was not freedom arriving all at once like sunrise. It was a tearing. Letters came back unopened. Calls rang into silence I could feel through the receiver. I saw my mother once outside the feed store months later, and she looked at me. I want you to know that. She truly looked at me, and her eyes filled. And then my father put his hand at her elbow, and she turned her face away so fast it was like watching a curtain drawn across a lit window. My own sister crossed the street rather than pass within arm's reach of me. For a long while I told the story to myself, the way the community would have told it, that I was too soft, too modern, too unwilling to bear what generations of women before me had borne without complaint, that I had broken a good home because I wanted an easier life than I deserved. Then I began seeing a counselor, a small, plain-spoken woman with reading glasses she was always misplacing, and it was in her office, months into our work together, after I had spent nearly 40 minutes explaining why my husband was not a violent man, and why the bishop had sounded so kind, and why no one had technically ever forced me to do anything, that she set down her pen and said, gently but without softening the truth of it, consent that only survives because refusing it has been made unbearable is not truly consent at all. She told me what I had lived through had a name, coercive control, and she gave me other words in the weeks that followed: bodily autonomy, emotional withdrawal used as punishment, community-enforced compliance, and one afternoon, when I could not stop hearing my own mother's voice saying most women are, my counselor leaned forward and said, "Your suffering was normalized, it was never sanctified, and something in me that had been braced my entire life finally set its weight down." I want to say clearly, because I think it matters more than the drama of the story, that I do not hate the people I left. My husband was not a monster twirling cruelty behind a kind face. My mother was not a monster. The bishop was not a monster. They were people who had been raised inside a structure so old it had stopped feeling like a structure at all, and had started to feel, to all of us, like simply the truth of the world, the way weather feels like truth rather than pattern. That structure gave me real and beautiful things too. A community that showed up with casseroles when someone died, hands that knew how to build a barn in a single day, a kind of faith lived through labor rather than performance, sisters who could make a full table out of almost nothing. I have never pretended the whole of it was without love, but I have learned that a system can contain real love and still be built to consume a woman whole, and that both of those truths can be true on the same Tuesday afternoon over the same shoe-fly pie. If you have made it this far in my story, I want to speak directly to you for a moment, whoever and wherever you are, because I do not think this story only belongs to women raised in bonnets and long dresses on quiet dirt roads. If you have ever measured the temperature of a room by the silence of the person who was supposed to love you best, I see you. If you have ever said yes to something because no would have cost you every ounce of warmth and safety you had left, I see you. If you were ever taught that your exhaustion was really pride, or your fear was really rebellion, or your limit was really selfishness dressed up in tired clothing, I see you. If your own mother loved you and still could not help you, because the wall between you was older than either of you had the power to tear down alone, I see you. You were not weak for lasting as long as you did, inside a structure built to make your own refusal feel like the sin. The structure was the failure, not you, not ever you. I live now in a small house with a garden I planted myself, in colors no one told me to choose, and I see my children on terms that grow a little easier every year, and some mornings I still wake up expecting the room to be cold before I remember that I am the one who decides the temperature of my own house now. If you are picturing me as I tell you all of this, and you want to know what I was wearing on the morning I finally walked down that lane for the last time, with my bag in my hand, and my heart going like a rabbit under my ribs, I will tell you it should be a soft, faded dove gray, the exact color of a sky in the hour before it decides whether it will snow or clear, because that was truly the color of that morning, and because gray, more than blue or green or the deep plain black we wore to meeting, is the color of a woman standing at the very edge of one life, with no certainty yet of what the next one will look like, only the quiet, stubborn decision to walk toward it anyway.